That's the first thing I remember seeing when I woke up 3 months ago. Not the sterile white ceiling of the hospital room, not the concerned faces of the doctors, not even the maze of tubes and wires that had become my temporary lifeline. Just blood, dried and brown against the stark white bandage wrapped around my head like some grotesque crown. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper. A nurse rushed over, her scrubs squeaking against the linoleum floor, and for a terrifying moment, I didn't recognize the face looking down at me. Not because she was a stranger, but because I couldn't remember if she was supposed to be familiar. "Maya, honey, you're awake," she said, her voice gentle but urgent. "Don't try to talk yet. You've been unconscious for 6 days, Maya." The name bounced around my skull like a marble in an empty can. I knew it was mine, some deep, instinctual part of me responded to it, but it felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. "What happened?" I managed to croak. The nurse's expression shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach clench with dread. Pity. The kind of look you give someone whose world is about to be turned upside down. "You were in an accident, sweetheart. A hit and run. You've suffered a traumatic brain injury, and, well, the doctors will explain everything when they make their rounds." Hit and run. The words should have triggered something: fear, anger, memories of squealing tires and shattering glass. Instead, they landed in my mind like stones dropped into a deep, dark well. I heard the splash, but the bottom was too far down to see. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of physical therapy, cognitive rehabilitation, and the slow, agonizing process of trying to piece together a life I couldn't remember living. 3 months of pretending to recognize faces that looked at me with love and familiarity while I felt nothing but an echoing emptiness where my memories should have been. Now, standing in the crowded hallway of Jefferson High School, I wished I could go back to that hospital bed. At least there, no one expected me to be someone I couldn't remember being. "Maya. Oh my God, I've been looking everywhere for you." A girl with auburn curls and bright green eyes came rushing toward me, her backpack bouncing against her hip. She threw her arms around me in a hug that felt both too intimate and completely foreign. I stood there rigidly, my arms at my sides, trying to summon some recognition, some spark of the friendship she clearly expected. "Sarah," I said, the name coming automatically now after 3 months of practice. "Hi," she pulled back, and I saw the hurt flash across her face before she covered it with a bright smile. "Are you okay? You look pale. Did you take your medication this morning?" "The medication. Anticonvulsants to prevent seizures, pain relievers for the constant headaches, antidepressants for the crushing weight of depression that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd become a walking pharmacy, my days measured out in pills and doctor's appointments. "I'm fine," I lied, the same lie I'd been telling everyone for weeks. "Just tired," but I wasn't fine. I was drowning in a life that didn't feel like mine, surrounded by people who knew me better than I knew myself. Sarah was supposedly my best friend since 7th grade. We'd apparently shared secrets, had sleepovers, gone to each other's birthday parties. She could tell stories about our friendship that made other people laugh, but when I heard them, it was like listening to tales about someone else entirely. "Did you finish the history essay?" she asked as we walked toward first period. "Mr. Peterson is going to be so mad if we don't turn it in today." I nodded, though I'd spent most of the previous night staring at my laptop screen, trying to write about the American Revolution while fighting off the migraine that had been building behind my eyes for days. Everything felt impossibly difficult now, not just the big things like remembering my own past, but the small, everyday tasks that other teenagers took for granted. Writing essays, following conversations, understanding social cues, it all required a level of mental energy that left me exhausted by noon. You know, Sarah said, her voice carefully casual, Jake asked about you yesterday. He wanted to know if you were going to Emily's party this weekend. Jake, my supposed boyfriend of 8 months. A tall, dark-haired boy who played basketball and drove a blue Honda Civic and looked at me with such heartbreaking hope every time we were together. He'd been patient, more patient than any 17-year-old should have to be, but I could see the frustration building in his eyes. How do you love someone who can't remember falling in love with you? I don't think I'm up for a party, I said. Maya, you can't keep isolating yourself like this. I know the accident was horrible, and I know you're still recovering, but you're missing out on your whole senior year. These are supposed to be the best years of our lives. The best years of our lives. The phrase hit me like a slap. If these were supposed to be the best years, what did that say about my future? I was 17 years old, and I felt like I was 1,000. Every day was a struggle just to get through the basic motions of existence. I said I'm fine, I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. Sarah stepped back, her eyes wide with surprise. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm just worried about you. The bell rang, saving me from having to respond. We walked into Mrs. Chen's chemistry class, and I took my usual seat by the window, grateful for the few minutes of silence before the lesson began. But even as I tried to focus on molecular structures and chemical bonds, I could feel the weight of concerned glances from my classmates. The girl who survived. That's what I'd become. The tragic figure who'd cheated death but lost herself in the process. Some of my classmates whispered about me in the hallways, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch fragments of conversation. Still doesn't remember anything. Doctors say she might never get her memories back. Not the same person anymore. They weren't wrong. I wasn't the same person anymore. The Maya who'd existed before the accident was gone, erased as effectively as if she'd died that night on Maple Street. What was left was a hollow shell, a stranger wearing her face and living her life. Maya, can you tell us about the difference between ionic and covalent bonds? Mrs. Chen's voice cut through my thoughts. I looked up to find 20 pairs of eyes staring at me expectantly. Before the accident, I'd apparently been a good student, honor roll, active in student government, the kind of teenager who balanced academics with an active social life. Now I struggled to remember basic concepts I'd supposedly mastered months ago. I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention, I admitted, heat rising in my cheeks. A few students snickered, and I saw Mrs. Chen exchange a concerned look with her teaching assistant. Another reminder that everyone was watching me, waiting to see if I'd ever be normal again. That's all right, Maya. Jennifer, can you help us out? The rest of the class period passed in a blur of scientific terminology that bounced off my brain like raindrops on glass. I took notes mechanically, my handwriting shaky and unfamiliar. Even my penmanship had changed since the accident, another small reminder of how much I'd lost. When the bell rang, I gathered my books and headed for the door, but Mrs. Chen called my name. Maya, could you stay for a minute? I waited as the other students filed out, their chatter fading into the hallway. Mrs. Chen approached me with that same careful expression everyone seemed to wear when they talked to me now, a mixture of concern and uncertainty, like they were afraid I might break if they spoke too loudly. How are you feeling? She asked. Really feeling, not the answer you give everyone else. I considered lying again, but something in her expression made me pause. Mrs. Chen had been my chemistry teacher for 2 years, though I could only remember the past 3 months. She'd been patient with my struggles, never making me feel stupid when I couldn't recall concepts I'd supposedly mastered. I feel like I'm drowning, I said quietly. Like I'm living someone else's life and everyone expects me to just pick up where she left off. Mrs. Chin nodded slowly. That must be incredibly isolating. It is. I look at my friends, my family, even my own reflection, and I don't recognize anything. It's like I'm an actor who's been thrown into a play without knowing the script, and everyone's watching to see if I'll remember my lines. Have you considered that maybe you don't have to remember the old script? She asked gently. Maybe this is a chance to write a new one. I stared at her, not understanding. What I mean is, maybe instead of trying so hard to be the person you were before, you could focus on discovering who you are now. The accident took away your memories, but it didn't take away your capacity to make new ones. Her words followed me as I left the classroom and made my way through the crowded hallways. Students rushed past me, their voices blending into a cacophony of teenage drama and excitement. I caught fragments of conversations about homework and relationships and weekend plans, the normal concerns of people my age that felt impossibly foreign to me now. I found myself walking toward the library, seeking refuge in the quiet stacks where I didn't have to perform the exhausting charade of being someone I couldn't remember. The librarian, Mrs. Rodriguez, gave me a kind smile as I passed her desk. She'd been another source of patience over the past few months, never making me feel ashamed when I couldn't remember books I'd supposedly read or projects I'd supposedly completed. I settled into a corner table with my history textbook, trying to make sense of the Revolutionary War essay that was due next period. But the words seemed to swim on the page, and the constant low-level headache that had become my companion since the accident began to intensify. Focus, Maya. Just focus. But focusing had become one of the hardest things in the world. My brain felt like a computer with a damaged hard drive, struggling to process information that should have been simple. I'd read the same paragraph 3 times when someone slid into the chair across from me. Hey, you! I looked up to see Jake Morrison sitting across from me, his basketball jacket slung over one shoulder and his dark hair still damp from morning practice. He was handsome in that all-American way that probably made other girls jealous, tall and athletic with kind brown eyes and a smile that seemed to light up his entire face. Looking at him, I felt nothing but a hollow ache where emotion should have been. Hi, I said, closing my textbook. There was no point in pretending I was getting any work done with him here. You missed lunch again, he said, his voice gentle but tinged with concern. Mrs. Patterson said you didn't show up for student council either. Student council? Another piece of my supposed life that felt like a costume that didn't fit. I'd apparently been class treasurer, responsible for fundraising and budget planning. The idea of managing money and organizing events seemed impossible now when I could barely manage to get through a single day. I wasn't hungry, I said. And I quit student council. Jake's expression shifted, disappointment flickering across his features. Maya, you loved student council. You were so excited about the winter formal fundraiser. That wasn't me, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. That was someone else who happened to live in my body. I don't remember loving student council. I don't remember loving anything. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we couldn't say. Jake had been trying so hard to be supportive, to be the perfect boyfriend who would help me heal and recover. But I could see the toll it was taking on him, the way his shoulders sagged with exhaustion, the forced cheerfulness in his voice when he talked to me. The doctors said your memories might come back gradually, he said finally. It's only been 3 months. Maybe you just need more time. And what if they don't come back? I asked. What if this is it? What if I never remember falling in love with you or why we were together or any of the things that made me? Jake reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers warm against my cold skin. I looked down at our joined hands and tried to feel something, love, affection, even simple comfort. But there was nothing, just the physical sensation of skin against skin. "Then we'll make new memories," he said, his voice fierce with determination. "We'll start over. I'll help you fall in love with me again." The earnestness in his voice made my chest tighten with guilt. He was a good person, probably the kind of boyfriend that other girls would kill for. Patient, caring, devoted. But I couldn't force myself to feel something that wasn't there, and it wasn't fair to either of us to keep pretending. "Jake," I said gently, "I don't think that's how love works." "Why not? If we were happy before, if we had something special, why can't we have it again?" "Because I'm not the same person," I wanted to say. "Because the girl you fell in love with is gone, and what's left is just a broken shadow wearing her face. Because every time you look at me with hope and love, I feel like I'm drowning in my own inadequacy." "I need time," I said instead. "I need space to figure out who I am now, without everyone expecting me to be who I was before." Jake's hand tightened on mine. "I don't want to lose you. You already lost me," I said softly. "The night of the accident. I'm sorry, but the person you're trying to hold on to doesn't exist anymore." I pulled my hand away and gathered my books, leaving Jake sitting alone at the table. As I walked away, I heard him call my name, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes, the disappointment that would inevitably follow. The rest of the school day passed in a haze of half-understood lessons and awkward social interactions. I ate lunch alone in an empty classroom, picking at a sandwich that tasted like cardboard. I skipped the classes where I knew I'd be expected to participate, instead spending the time in the nurse's office with a fake headache that wasn't entirely fake. By the time the final bell rang, I felt like I'd run a marathon. The simple act of getting through a single day at school had become monumentally exhausting. I walked slowly to the pickup area where my aunt would be waiting to drive me home, another reminder that I couldn't even remember how to drive, couldn't be trusted with the independence that other kids my age took for granted. Aunt Linda was leaning against her silver sedan, scrolling through her phone with the kind of casual patience that suggested she'd been doing this routine for a while. She looked up as I approached, and her face broke into a warm smile. "There's my girl," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like vanilla perfume and coffee. "How was school today?" "Fine," I said, the automatic response that had become my default answer to any question about my well-being. Aunt Linda had moved in with us after the accident to help with my care, and her presence had become as routine as the physical therapy appointments and neurologist visits that marked my weeks. She was my mother's younger sister, a woman in her early 40s who'd never married or had children of her own. She'd stepped into the role of caregiver with a dedication that sometimes felt overwhelming. "Your mom's working late again," she said as we drove through the familiar streets of our suburban neighborhood. "Another big case at the law firm. I thought maybe we could order pizza and watch a movie tonight. Something fun and light." I nodded absently, staring out the window at houses and streets that should have been familiar but felt foreign. Even my own neighborhood felt like a movie set, beautiful and detailed but somehow artificial. I knew these streets intellectually. I could give directions to my house, identify landmarks, navigate the routes to school and the mall. But the emotional connection, the sense of home that should have come with familiarity, was completely absent. We pulled into the driveway of our two-story colonial house, and I followed Aunt Linda inside. The house was exactly what you'd expect from a successful lawyer's family, tastefully decorated, immaculately clean, full of the kind of meaningful objects that spoke to a life well lived. Family photos lined the hallway, showing moments of happiness and connection that I couldn't remember experiencing. There I was in dozens of pictures, birthday parties, family vacations, school events, casual moments of everyday life. but looking at them was like looking at photographs of a stranger who happened to share my face. The girl in those pictures was animated, confident, surrounded by friends and family who clearly adored her. She bore no resemblance to the hollow, confused person I'd become. "I'm going to start on some homework," I said, heading toward the stairs. "Maya, wait." Aunt Linda's voice stopped me on the bottom step. "There's something I wanted to talk to you about." I turned back, noting the serious expression on her face. In the 3 months since the accident, Aunt Linda had been careful to keep things light and positive, never pushing too hard or asking questions that might upset me. Her sudden gravity made something cold settle in my stomach. "What is it?" I asked. "It's about your therapy sessions with Dr. Williams," she said, referring to the neuropsychologist I'd been seeing twice a week since leaving the hospital. "He mentioned that you've been having some breakthrough moments. Fragments of memories starting to surface." I frowned. "He said that?" I thought patient confidentiality. "He didn't share any details," Aunt Linda said quickly. "Just mentioned that you might be on the verge of remembering more about the night of the accident. I wanted to talk to you about that, about what it might mean for your recovery." The night of the accident. The black hole in my memory that everyone seemed to dance around. I'd been told the basic facts, that I'd been walking home from Sarah's house around 11 p.m., that a car had struck me and driven away, that I'd been found unconscious by a jogger who'd called 911. But the actual memories of that night remained completely blank, as if they'd been surgically removed from my brain. "I don't remember anything new," I said. "Just fragments. Images that don't make sense. Feelings without context." "What kind of feelings?" I hesitated. The truth was, when I tried to think about that night, I was overwhelmed by a sense of fear and betrayal that seemed to have no source. Not fear of the accident itself, but something deeper and more personal. A feeling that I'd been hurt by someone I trusted, that the world wasn't as safe as I'd believed it to be. "Fear," I said finally. "But I don't know what I was afraid of." Aunt Linda nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd been thinking. Memory recovery can be tricky, especially with traumatic events. Sometimes our brains protect us by keeping certain memories locked away until we're ready to handle them. "Do you think I'll ever remember?" "I think you'll remember what you need to remember, when you're ready." She paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "But Maya, I want you to know that whatever you remember, whatever you discover about that night, I'm here for you. You're not alone in this." Her words should have been comforting, but something in her tone made me uneasy. There was an undercurrent of tension, as if she were preparing me for something unpleasant. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I asked. "Something about the accident that I don't know?" "Nothing concrete," she said. "Just instincts. Feelings. Sometimes I wonder if there might have been more to that night than we realized." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe the accident wasn't as random as everyone assumed. Maybe there was a reason you were out walking so late, a reason you were on that particular street at that particular time." My heart started beating faster. "Are you saying someone targeted me specifically?" "I'm saying that when you're ready to remember, I'll be here to help you make sense of whatever you discover." She reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "But until then, try not to push too hard. Your brain has been through enough trauma." I nodded and headed upstairs to my room, but Aunt Linda's words followed me. The suggestion that my accident might not have been random opened up possibilities I'd never considered. If someone had targeted me specifically, that meant the attack was personal. It meant someone had wanted to hurt me, maybe even kill me. But who? And why? My room was a shrine to the person I used to be. The walls were covered with photos of friends, awards from school, concert tickets, and other mementos of a life I couldn't remember living. My desk was organized with the kind of meticulous care that suggested I'd been a serious student. My bookshelf was filled with novels I couldn't remember reading, textbooks for classes I couldn't remember taking. I sat on my bed and opened my laptop, staring at the desktop wallpaper, a photo of me and Sarah at what looked like a beach somewhere, both of us laughing at something off camera. We looked so young and carefree, untouched by tragedy or loss. It was hard to believe that happy girl was supposed to be me. I opened my browser and, after a moment's hesitation, typed Maya Richardson hit and run into the search bar. I'd done this dozens of times over the past few months, searching for information about my own accident like a detective investigating a case. The results were always the same, a handful of local news articles with headlines like "Local Teen Critically Injured in Hit and Run" and "Community Rallies Around Accident Victim." The articles contained basic facts but no real insights. I'd been struck by a vehicle while walking on Maple Street around 11 p.m. on a Friday night. The driver had fled the scene. I'd been found by a jogger and rushed to the hospital with severe head trauma. Police had no leads and no witnesses, but tonight, something made me dig deeper. Instead of just reading the news articles, I started looking at the comments sections, searching for details that might not have made it into the official reports. Most of the comments were the usual mix of sympathy and outrage you'd expect. But one comment, buried deep in a thread on the local newspaper's website, caught my attention. I heard she wasn't just walking randomly. Someone told me she was meeting someone that night. Makes you wonder if this was really an accident or if someone wanted to hurt her specifically. The comment was anonymous and had been posted just a few days after the accident. It had no replies, no follow-up information. But it echoed what Aunt Linda had suggested, that there might have been more to that night than anyone realized. I spent the next hour searching through social media, looking for any mention of my accident or the events leading up to it. What I found was a typical teenage digital footprint, posts about school events, photos with friends, complaints about homework and tests. But as I scrolled back to the weeks before the accident, I noticed something strange. My posting frequency had dropped off dramatically in the days leading up to that Friday night. My last post was from the Wednesday before the accident, a photo of me and Jake at lunch with the caption, "Good food, better company, red heart." But before that, there was a gap of nearly a week with no posts at all. That was unusual. Based on my posting history, I'd been an active social media user, posting multiple times a day. The sudden silence suggested something had been wrong, something significant enough to make me withdraw from my usual online presence. I clicked through to my direct messages, hoping to find some clue about what had been bothering me. Most of the conversations were typical teenage chatter, homework help, plans for the weekend, gossip about classmates. But one conversation thread made me pause. It was with my mom, dated the day before the accident. "Mom, haven't heard from you today. Everything okay? Me, just tired. Long week. Mom, are you sure? You've seemed distant lately. Is everything okay at school? With Jake? Me, everything's fine. Don't worry about me, Mom, it's my job to worry about you. Linda mentioned you seemed upset about something earlier this week. Me, Linda needs to mind her own business. Mom, Maya, that's not like you. Linda's just concerned. We all are. Me, I said I'm fine. Can we drop it?" The conversation ended there, but the tone troubled me. I'd been defensive, almost hostile toward my mother and aunt. That didn't match the picture everyone had painted of me as a happy, well-adjusted teenager with strong family relationships. What had I been upset about? What had happened earlier that week to make me withdraw from the people who cared about me? I closed the laptop and lay back on my bed, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the locked vaults of my damaged memory were the answers to these questions. But trying to access them was like trying to open a door that had been welded shut. The harder I pushed, the more firmly it resisted. A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. "Maya? Dinner's ready," Aunt Linda called. "Coming," I replied, though the last thing I wanted was to sit through another meal of careful conversation and concerned glances. Downstairs, Aunt Linda had ordered pizza from my supposed favorite restaurant and set up the coffee table in the living room for a casual dinner in front of the TV. She'd chosen a romantic comedy from the early 2000s, something light and harmless that wouldn't trigger any difficult emotions. "I thought this might be fun," she said, settling onto the couch beside me. "A nice, relaxing evening. You've seemed stressed lately." I took a bite of pizza that tasted like cardboard and tried to focus on the movie. But my mind kept wandering back to the conversation with my mother, to the suggestion that I'd been upset about something in the days before the accident. "Aunt Linda," I said during a quiet moment in the film, "do you remember me being upset about anything before the accident?" "Mom mentioned in a text that you thought I seemed bothered by something." Aunt Linda paused with her pizza halfway to her mouth. "Oh, that. I'm not sure I'd call it upset exactly. You just seemed preoccupied. Like you had something on your mind. Do you have any idea what it might have been?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her words carefully. "I thought maybe you and Jake were having problems. You know how teenage relationships can be, intense and complicated. I figured it was just normal growing pains, but you mentioned it to my mom. It must have been more than just normal teenage drama." "I was probably overreacting," she said, her voice dismissive. "You know how it is when you're living with someone, you notice every little mood change, every sigh and frown." I'm sure it was nothing important, but something in her tone suggested it had been important, at least to her. There was a careful quality to her words, as if she were editing her thoughts before speaking them aloud. The movie continued, but I found myself studying Aunt Linda's profile in the flickering light from the TV screen. She was an attractive woman, younger than my mother by several years, with the kind of effortless style that suggested she'd been popular in high school. She'd never married, had no children of her own, and had built a successful career in marketing that allowed her to work remotely most of the time. She'd given up her independence to move in with us after the accident, abandoning her own apartment and social life to help care for me. It was an enormous sacrifice, and I was grateful for it. But sometimes I wondered what she'd given up, what dreams or plans she'd put on hold to become my caregiver. "Aunt Linda," I said, "don't you miss your old life? Your apartment, your friends, your freedom?" She turned to look at me, surprised by the question. "What makes you ask that?" I feel guilty sometimes. You've given up so much to take care of me, and I can't even remember why I'm worth it." Her expression softened, and she reached over to squeeze my hand. "Oh, Maya. You're worth everything to me. You're my family. When your grandmother died, when your parents, when it was just you and your mom left, I promised myself I'd always be here for you. The accident just made that promise more important. But don't you want your own life? Your own family?" "I have my family," she said firmly. "I have you and your mom. That's enough for me." There was something final in her tone that discouraged further questions. We turned back to the movie, but I found myself thinking about family dynamics, about the bonds that hold people together and the sacrifices they make for each other. When the movie ended, I helped Aunt Linda clean up the pizza boxes and said goodnight. But instead of going to bed, I found myself drawn back to my laptop. I opened a new browser window and started searching for information about my family history, looking for clues that might help me understand the relationships I'd lost along with my memories. What I found was a story of tragedy and resilience. My father had died in a car accident when I was 12, leaving my mother to raise me alone. My grandmother had helped, providing both emotional and financial support until her death from cancer 2 years later. Through it all, Aunt Linda had been a constant presence, the reliable sister who stepped in whenever we needed help. On paper, it was a beautiful story of family loyalty and love. But something about it bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on what. I was about to close the laptop when I noticed something strange in one of the obituaries I'd found for my grandmother. It mentioned that she'd left behind a considerable estate and had been a shrewd investor who accumulated significant wealth over her lifetime. I'd never heard anyone mention my grandmother being particularly wealthy. In fact, from the stories I'd been told, our family had always been solidly middle class, comfortable but not rich. Why would the obituary emphasize her wealth if it wasn't significant? I tried searching for more information about my grandmother's estate, but public records were limited. What I could find suggested that she'd indeed been wealthier than I'd realized, with investments and properties that had been passed down to her surviving family members. If my grandmother had been wealthy, and if that wealth had been passed down to my mother and me, it might explain some things. It might explain why Aunt Linda had been so willing to give up her independence to help care for me. It might explain the careful way everyone talked about family finances, as if there were sensitive topics that shouldn't be discussed. But it also raised questions. If our family had significant wealth, why was my mother working such long hours at the law firm? Why did we live in a nice but not extravagant house? Why had no one ever mentioned the inheritance when discussing my future, my college plans, my long-term care needs? The questions multiplied in my mind, each one leading to 3 more. I realized I was venturing into territory that felt dangerous somehow, though I couldn't explain why. It was as if my subconscious was warning me away from certain thoughts, certain possibilities. I closed the laptop and tried to push the questions out of my mind. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were secrets in my family's history. Secrets that might be connected to the fear and betrayal I felt whenever I tried to remember the night of my accident. Somewhere in the darkness of my damaged memory, answers were waiting. The question was whether I was brave enough to find them, and whether I was strong enough to handle what I might discover. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in my mind: what if the accident wasn't random? What if someone I trusted had wanted to hurt me? The possibility was too terrible to fully contemplate, but it lingered at the edges of my consciousness like a shadow, waiting to be acknowledged. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start looking for answers. I would stop being a passive victim of my circumstances and start being an active investigator of my own life. Whatever secrets my family was hiding, whatever had happened that night on Maple Street, I was going to find the truth, even if it destroyed everything I thought I knew about the people I loved. The manila folder felt heavy in my hands as I sat in my car outside the law offices of Patterson and Associates. 3 weeks of careful investigation, 3 weeks of following paper trails and asking subtle questions, had led me to this moment. Inside the folder were bank statements, insurance documents, and legal papers that painted a picture so disturbing I could barely process it. But I was getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the night everything began to unravel. It was a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after my conversation with Aunt Linda about family secrets. I'd been having more frequent headaches, and Dr. Williams had suggested they might be related to recovered memories trying to surface. The pain had been so intense that night that I'd gone to bed early, hoping sleep would provide relief. Instead, I had the dream. I was walking down Maple Street in the darkness, my footsteps echoing off the empty sidewalk. But in the dream, I wasn't alone. Someone was walking beside me, someone I trusted completely. We were talking in hushed, urgent voices about something important, something that had to be kept secret. "You can't tell anyone about this," the voice said. "Not until we figure out what to do." "I won't," I heard myself reply. "But we have to do something." "This isn't right." "I know, sweetheart. I know. But we have to be careful. If the wrong people find out." The conversation continued, but the words became muddled, overlapping with the sound of an approaching car engine. In the dream, I turned to look at the headlights, and for a split second, I saw the face of the person walking beside me. It was Aunt Linda. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The dream had felt more real than any memory I'd experienced since the accident. But that couldn't be right. According to everyone's account of that night, I'd been walking alone when the car struck me. Aunt Linda had been at home, and she'd found out about the accident when the hospital called. Unless everyone had been lying. The thought was so disturbing that I tried to push it away, but it clung to me like a shadow. Over the next few days, I found myself watching Aunt Linda more carefully, looking for signs that she might be hiding something. What I saw made my blood run cold. She was always there. Every conversation I had with my mother about my recovery, every phone call with doctors, every discussion about my future, Aunt Linda was present, listening, sometimes guiding the conversation in subtle ways. She answered questions before I could speak, made decisions about my care without consulting me, and seemed to have an unusual amount of influence over every aspect of my life. More troubling, I started noticing inconsistencies in the stories she told about the night of my accident. Sometimes she said she'd been reading when the hospital called. Other times, she mentioned watching television. Once, she said she'd been on the phone with a friend, but when I asked which friend, she became vague and changed the subject. The turning point came when I decided to visit the scene of the accident. I'd asked Jake to drive me to Maple Street, telling him I thought seeing the location might help trigger more memories. He'd been hesitant. We'd been trying to rebuild our relationship slowly, and he was worried that confronting the trauma directly might set back my progress. But I convinced him it was something I needed to do. Maple Street was a quiet residential road lined with old oak trees. During the day, it was peaceful and suburban, the kind of place where children rode bicycles and neighbors walked their dogs. But at night, it would have been isolated and dark, with long stretches between streetlights. "The police report said you were found right here," Jake said, pointing to a spot near the intersection with Pine Avenue. "Mrs. Henderson was out jogging around 11:30 when she saw you." I stood on the sidewalk, trying to feel some connection to the place where my life had changed forever. But there was nothing, just concrete and asphalt, as emotionally neutral as any random street corner. "Why would I have been walking here?" I asked. "Sarah's house is in the opposite direction from our neighborhood." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "Everyone said I was walking home from Sarah's house. But her house is on Elm Street, which is north of downtown. Maple Street is south. If I were walking home from her place, I'd never come anywhere near here." We stood there in silence, both of us processing the implications. Either I hadn't been walking home from Sarah's house that night, or I'd taken a significant detour for reasons no one had explained. "Maybe you stopped somewhere else first," Jake suggested. "A store, or another friend's house." "Maybe," I said, but the explanation felt hollow. Or maybe I wasn't walking home from Sarah's house at all. That night, I called Sarah and asked her directly about the night of my accident. "Oh, Maya," she said, her voice immediately becoming gentle and concerned. "You know I wasn't actually with you that night, right? I was at Emily's sleepover. I think there might have been some confusion in those first few days after the accident, when everyone was trying to piece together what had happened. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean you weren't with me? Everyone said I was walking home from your house. No, sweetie. I was at Emily's place with like 6 other girls. We were having a movie marathon. I didn't even know about your accident until the next morning when my mom told me. The phone slipped from my numb fingers. If I hadn't been at Sarah's house that night, then where had I been? And why had everyone, including Aunt Linda, told me I was walking home from there? I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what I'd learned. Someone had lied to me about the basic facts of my accident. The question was who, and why. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to investigate my own case, treating it like the mystery it clearly was. I would start with the financial questions that had been nagging at me, then work my way back to the night of the accident. My first stop was the bank. I'd found some old statements in my mother's desk, statements for accounts I didn't know existed. The balances were substantial, far more money than I'd expected a middle-class family to have. When I asked the bank manager about the accounts, what I learned made my hands shake. These are trust accounts, she explained, pulling up records on her computer. Established by your grandmother several years ago. The funds were meant to be distributed to you on your 18th birthday, with your Aunt Linda as the trustee until then. How much money are we talking about? I asked. The number she gave me was staggering. Not just college tuition money, but life-changing wealth. Enough to buy a house, start a business, live comfortably for years without working. Has anyone accessed these funds recently? I asked. The bank manager's expression became guarded. I can't discuss specific transactions without proper authorization, but I can tell you that there have been some irregularities that we've been monitoring. What kind of irregularities? Transfers that seemed unusual given the account's intended purpose. Nothing illegal, you understand, but patterns that raised some red flags internally. She couldn't give me more details without a court order, but she suggested I might want to consult with an attorney about protecting my interests. The implication was clear. Someone had been using my money in ways that weren't necessarily proper. That afternoon, I made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud. What he told me made my worst fears seem naive. Trust fund abuse is more common than people realize, he explained. When large sums of money are involved, and when the beneficiary is young or incapacitated, trustees sometimes lose sight of their fiduciary responsibilities. He walked me through the legal documents, explaining how my grandmother's will had been structured. The money was mine, but Aunt Linda had complete control over it until I turned 18. More concerning, if something happened to me before I reached that age, the funds would revert to my next of kin, which, with my father dead and my mother struggling financially, essentially meant Aunt Linda. How much money has been moved out of the accounts? I asked. The lawyer's expression was grim. Over the past 3 years, approximately 60% of the original trust value. The transfers were technically legal, classified as expenses for your care and education. But the amounts seem excessive for their stated purposes. 60%. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, gone. Money that was supposed to secure my future, used to fund someone else's lifestyle. What can I do about it? I asked. If you can prove the funds were misused, you can petition the court to remove the trustee and recover the missing money. But you'll need evidence, and you'll need to be prepared for a fight. Family financial disputes can get very ugly, very quickly. I left the lawyer's office with my head spinning. The woman who'd been caring for me, who'd sacrificed her independence to help with my recovery, had been systematically stealing from me for years. But the theft was just the beginning of the horror I was about to uncover. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I searched Aunt Linda's room. I waited until she'd gone to the grocery store, then slipped into her bedroom with my heart pounding. I felt terrible about violating her privacy, but I needed to know the truth about what she'd been doing with my money. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Hidden in a box in her closet were documents that painted a picture of financial desperation and careful planning. Credit card statements showing massive debts. Loan applications that had been denied. Correspondence with collection agencies demanding payment for overdue accounts. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails between Aunt Linda and someone named Marcus Chen, emails that discussed the Maya situation in terms that made my blood run cold. From Linda Richardson, marketing@email.com, to marcuschen.consulting@email.com. Subject: Timeline update. Marcus, the trust funds are almost depleted, but I think I can stretch them another 6 months if I'm careful. The bigger problem is that she's starting to ask questions about college expenses and her grandmother's will. I'm running out of ways to explain the discrepancies. We need to move up our timeline. The longer this drags out, the more likely it becomes that she'll discover what's really been happening. L. From marcuschen.consulting@email.com, to Linda Richardson, marketing@email.com. Subject: Timeline update. Linda, I understand your concerns, but we can't rush this. It has to look natural, accidental. If there's any suggestion of foul play, the insurance companies will investigate thoroughly, and that could expose everything. Stick to the original plan. Make it look like a random tragedy, wrong place, wrong time. The life insurance payout will more than make up for what you've already spent from the trust. M. I stared at the screen of Aunt Linda's laptop, reading the emails over and over again, trying to process what they meant. They were discussing my death. Not metaphorically, not hypothetically, but as a concrete plan with timelines and financial incentives. My aunt, the woman who'd held my hand through countless medical appointments, who'd slept in hospital chairs during my recovery, who'd given up her life to care for me, had been planning to kill me. The hit and run hadn't been random. It had been attempted murder. With shaking hands, I scrolled through more emails, finding details that made me physically sick. They'd been planning it for months, waiting for the right opportunity. The night of the accident, Aunt Linda had lured me out with some story about having important information to share. She'd driven me to Maple Street, probably planning to make it look like I'd been walking alone when a car struck me, but something had gone wrong. Maybe I'd figured out what was happening. Maybe I'd tried to run. The emails didn't specify, but one message from the day after the accident was chillingly clear. She survived. The doctors say she might have permanent memory loss, which could actually work in our favor. If she can't remember that night, she can't connect us to what happened. We stick to the story: random hit and run, tragic accident. I'll take care of her during the recovery, make sure she doesn't remember anything inconvenient. The memory loss hadn't been an unfortunate side effect of my injuries. It had been a gift to my would-be killers, a natural cover-up that eliminated their biggest threat, my ability to identify them. But memories, I was learning, have a way of fighting back. As I read through the emails, fragments of that night began returning. I remembered getting a call from Aunt Linda, telling me she had something important to show me about my parents' deaths. I remembered meeting her at a coffee shop downtown, then driving with her toward what she said was an important location. I remembered the growing sense of unease as we drove through unfamiliar neighborhoods, the way her hands gripped the steering wheel, the forced casualness of her conversation. And I remembered the moment when everything clicked into place, when I realized that the woman sitting next to me wasn't trying to help me understand my family's history. She was planning to make me part of it. The rest of the memory was still hazy, but I could piece together what must have happened. I'd probably tried to get out of the car, or threatened to expose her theft. She'd struck me with the vehicle, probably hoping to make it look like I'd been hit while walking. But I'd survived, and the brain injury had given her an unexpected opportunity to control the narrative of what had happened. For 3 months, she'd been playing the role of devoted caregiver while secretly celebrating the fact that her crime had been perfectly covered up. Every concerned look, every gentle encouragement, every moment of supposed love and support had been an act designed to keep me from remembering the truth. I heard the front door open downstairs. Aunt Linda was back from the store. Quickly, I closed the laptop and returned everything to its original position. Then I crept back to my room, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd discovered. I had evidence of her theft, and I had emails that strongly suggested she'd been involved in my accident. But would it be enough to prove attempted murder? More importantly, what was I going to do about it? I could call the police, but Aunt Linda had been careful. The emails discussed the plan in vague terms that might be explained away as hypothetical conversations or misunderstandings. The financial theft was clearer, but even that had been technically legal due to her role as trustee. And there was another problem. She was downstairs right now, and she still believed I had no memory of what had really happened. If she suspected I'd discovered the truth, would she try to finish what she'd started? Maya? Her voice drifted up from the kitchen. I'm making dinner. Are you hungry? I listened to her moving around downstairs, preparing a meal for the person she'd tried to kill. The normalcy of it was surreal, a would-be murderer making pasta sauce, humming softly to herself as if she were any other caring relative. But I wasn't going to be her victim again. This time, I was going to be ready. Over the next few days, I put together a plan. I copied all the incriminating emails and financial documents, storing them in a secure cloud account that Aunt Linda couldn't access. I made an appointment with the police, though I scheduled it for the following week to give myself time to gather more evidence. Most importantly, I started carrying a small digital recorder that Jake had given me for school projects. If Aunt Linda was going to make any incriminating statements, I wanted them on tape. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. It was a Friday evening, exactly 4 months after the accident. My mother was working late again, and Aunt Linda had suggested we order Chinese food and watch a movie. But as we sat in the living room with our takeout containers, I noticed she seemed unusually tense. Maya, she said during a quiet moment in the film, I've been thinking about your recovery. About how much progress you've made. What about it? I asked, my hand instinctively moving to the recorder in my pocket. It's just. Dr. Williams mentioned that your memories might be starting to come back. Fragments of the night of the accident. He said that? I turned to face her, noting the carefully controlled expression on her face. I thought patient confidentiality. He was just expressing concern, she said quickly. About how traumatic memories might affect your healing process. He wanted to make sure we were prepared to support you if you started remembering difficult things. The conversation felt familiar, but this time I understood the subtext. She wasn't worried about my emotional well-being. She was worried about what I might remember. What kind of difficult things? I asked. Well, the accident itself was traumatic. But there might be other things too. Things from before that night that were troubling you. She was fishing, trying to determine how much I knew without revealing her own involvement. I decided to test her. Actually, I said, I have been remembering some things. Fragments, like Dr. Williams said. I remember being upset about something in the days before the accident. Something about family. Aunt Linda's fork paused halfway to her mouth. What kind of family issues? I'm not sure yet. But I remember feeling like someone I trusted was lying to me. Someone close to me. Maya, she said carefully, sometimes when we're recovering from trauma, our minds can play tricks on us. False memories can feel very real, but that doesn't mean they actually happen. Are you saying my memories aren't real? I'm saying you should be careful about jumping to conclusions based on fragmentary recollections. Memory is unreliable under the best circumstances, and you've been through significant trauma. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands had started to shake slightly. She was afraid of what I might remember, which meant there was definitely something to remember. What if they're not false memories? I pressed. What if I really was upset about something, and that's why I was out walking that night? You were walking home from Sarah's house, she said automatically. No, I wasn't. I watched her face carefully as I delivered the information. I called Sarah. She wasn't even with me that night. She was at Emily's sleepover. The color drained from Aunt Linda's face, but she recovered quickly. There must have been some confusion in those first few days after the accident. Maybe you were at someone else's house, or maybe you were just out for a walk, or maybe someone picked me up and drove me to Maple Street for reasons they don't want me to remember. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken accusations. Aunt Linda set down her fork and turned to face me fully. Maya, what are you really asking me? This was it. The moment of truth. I could confront her directly with what I'd discovered, or I could continue probing and hope she revealed more. The recorder was running in my pocket, capturing every word. I'm asking if there's something about that night that you haven't told me, I said. Something about why I was really on Maple Street, or who I might have been with. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, I interrupted. I'm asking directly. Is there anything about my accident that you haven't told me? Aunt Linda was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. There are some things about that night that might be difficult for you to hear. My heart started pounding, but I kept my voice steady. What kind of things? The truth is, Maya, you weren't just randomly walking when that car hit you. You were meeting someone. Someone who had information about your family that you needed to hear. Who was I meeting? She looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. The mask of concern and care finally slipped away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. You were meeting me. The admission hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. I'd expected it, but hearing her say it out loud still sent shockwaves through my system. Why? I managed to ask. Because you'd discovered something about your trust fund. About the money your grandmother left you. Her voice was steady now, almost matter of fact. You'd figured out that I'd been using it to pay my debts, and you were threatening to go to the police. So you decided to kill me? I decided to protect my family, she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. Do you have any idea what it was like, watching you inherit everything while I got nothing? I spent 5 years taking care of your grandmother, managing her affairs, making sure she was comfortable in her final years. And what did I get for it? The privilege of watching a teenager inherit a fortune she'd done nothing to earn. It wasn't your money, I said, my voice shaking with anger and fear. It should have been. She stood up, and I noticed her hands were no longer shaking. She seemed calmer now that the truth was finally out in the open. I deserved that money more than you did. I'd worked for it, sacrificed for it. All you did was exist. So you tried to murder me. I tried to solve a problem, she corrected. You were going to destroy everything I'd worked for. The life insurance payout would have been substantial, and with you gone, the remaining trust funds would have reverted to the family. It would have been a tragedy, of course, but at least the money would have gone to someone who appreciated it. The casual way she discussed my murder was almost more terrifying than the act itself. To her, I wasn't a person with hopes and dreams and a right to life. I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle between her and financial security. But I survived, I said. Yes, you survived. And for a while, I thought that might actually work out better. The memory loss meant you couldn't expose what I'd done, and I could continue managing your affairs while you recovered. It was almost perfect, almost, until you started remembering. She was watching me carefully now, studying my face like a predator sizing up its prey. At first, I thought the fragments were harmless. But tonight, listening to you ask these questions, seeing the way you're looking at me, I know you remember more than you're letting on. My blood turned to ice. What are you saying? I'm saying this conversation is over, Maya. And so are you. She moved toward the kitchen, and I heard the sound of a drawer opening. When she returned, she was holding a large kitchen knife, its blade gleaming in the lamplight. This time, she said, her voice eerily calm, I'm going to make sure there are no mistakes. Time seemed to slow down as she approached me, the knife held with the casual competence of someone who'd already committed to violence. But this time, I wasn't a confused, trusting victim. This time, I was ready. I rolled off the couch and grabbed the heavy ceramic lamp from the side table, hurling it at her with all my strength. It struck her shoulder, throwing off her balance and sending the knife clattering across the hardwood floor. Help! I screamed as loudly as I could, hoping the neighbors might hear. Someone help me! Aunt Linda recovered quickly, lunging toward the fallen knife. But I was faster, my months of physical therapy having restored most of my strength and coordination. I reached the front door before she could stop me, my fingers fumbling with the deadbolt as I heard her footsteps behind me. The door swung open just as she grabbed my shoulder, her nails digging into my skin. I twisted away and ran into the street, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. Lights came on in neighboring houses. Dogs started barking. Someone shouted that they were calling 911. Aunt Linda stood in the doorway for a moment, the knife still in her hand, calculating whether she could finish what she'd started before help arrived. But the sound of approaching sirens made the decision for her. She dropped the knife and ran toward her car, but she didn't make it. The police arrived just as she was backing out of the driveway, their flashing lights turning the quiet suburban street into a crime scene. As I watched them arrest the woman who'd tried to kill me twice, who'd stolen my inheritance and manipulated my recovery, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 4 months, complete, absolute clarity. I remembered everything now. Not just the night of the accident, but the days leading up to it. The growing suspicion that something was wrong with my finances. The confrontation with Aunt Linda about the missing money. The way she tried to convince me that I was imagining things, that my concerns were just teenage paranoia. I remembered the phone call that Friday night, her urgent voice telling me she had proof of something terrible, something about my parents' deaths that I needed to know. I remembered meeting her at the coffee shop, the way she'd seemed nervous and distracted. I remembered getting into her car, trusting her completely even as my instincts screamed that something was wrong. And I remembered the moment when I realized she wasn't driving toward any meeting place or important location. She was driving toward an empty stretch of road where no one would witness what she was about to do. The hit and run had been carefully planned, but it had also been improvised. She'd probably intended to make it look like I'd been walking alone when struck by a random driver. But when I'd figured out what was happening and tried to escape the car, she'd had to adapt quickly. The memory loss had been her salvation, giving her 4 months to play the role of devoted caregiver while she figured out how to finish what she'd started. But memory, like truth, has a way of fighting back against those who try to suppress it. As the paramedics checked me for injuries and the police took my statement, I thought about the past 4 months. The isolation, the confusion, the constant feeling that I couldn't trust my own instincts. All of it had been orchestrated by the person who was supposed to protect me, but I'd survived. Not just the accident, but the aftermath. I'd found my way back to the truth despite having every obstacle placed in my path. 3 hours later, sitting in the police station with my mother beside me, she'd raced back from her office the moment she heard. I listened as Detective Morrison explained what they'd found in Aunt Linda's room. "The financial fraud is clear-cut," he said. "She's been systematically draining your trust accounts for over 3 years. The emails we found on her laptop provide strong evidence of premeditation for both the original attack and tonight's incident." "What about the murder charge?" my mother asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "The emails are suggestive, but they're not explicit confessions. However, with Ms. Maya's testimony about what happened tonight, combined with the recovered memories of the original incident, we have a strong case for attempted murder." My mother squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you." "You couldn't have known," I said, and I meant it. Aunt Linda had been careful, playing her role perfectly. The grieving sister helping to care for her injured niece. Who would have suspected that the same woman who'd spent nights sleeping in hospital chairs had been the one who'd put me there? "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Detective Morrison said, "you get your life back. The stolen money will be recovered and returned to your accounts. Ms. Richardson will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And you can start moving forward." Moving forward. The phrase sounded impossibly hopeful after 4 months of being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't remember having. But as we drove home that night, passing the spot on Maple Street where my old life had ended and my new one had begun, I realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering everything, the good and the bad, the love and the betrayal, the trust and the terrible violation of that trust. I'd lost 4 months of my life to amnesia and manipulation. But I'd also gained something valuable, the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. Strong enough to survive attempted murder. Strong enough to piece together the truth despite having my memory stolen. Strong enough to fight back when cornered by someone who thought I was helpless. The girl who'd existed before the accident was gone, erased as completely as if she'd died that night. But the person who'd emerged from the wreckage was tougher, wiser, and infinitely more capable of protecting herself. As we pulled into our driveway, I made a silent promise to the person I used to be and the person I was becoming. I would never again allow anyone to make me doubt my own instincts. I would never again be anyone's victim, and I would never, ever forget the price of misplaced trust. 6 months later, at Aunt Linda's sentencing hearing, I stood before the judge and read a victim impact statement that I'd worked on for weeks. I talked about the months of confusion and isolation, about the betrayal by someone I'd loved and trusted, about the long process of rebuilding not just my memories but my ability to trust anyone. But I also talked about resilience. About the strength that emerges from surviving the unsurvivable. About the way trauma can either destroy you or forge you into something unbreakable. Aunt Linda received 20 years for attempted murder and financial fraud. As they led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at me once, and I saw something I hadn't expected in her eyes: regret. Not for what she'd done, but for getting caught. That night, Jake and I went to dinner at a restaurant downtown. Our relationship had changed since the truth came out, how could it not? But we'd been working on rebuilding it based on who we were now, not who we'd been before. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't remembered? He asked as we shared dessert. Sometimes, I admitted. But I think I would have figured it out eventually. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when people try to bury it. Are you angry about losing those 4 months? I considered the question. I was angry. I'm still angry sometimes. But I'm also grateful for surviving, for remembering, for discovering that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I reached across the table and took his hand. And for people like you, who stick around even when everything falls apart. As we walked home that night, I thought about memory and identity, about the stories we tell ourselves and the stories others tell about us. I thought about trust and betrayal, about family bonds and the terrible things people do for money. But mostly, I thought about the future. About college applications and career plans and all the possibilities that stretched out ahead of me. The money that Aunt Linda had stolen was being returned with interest, giving me financial security I'd never expected to have. More importantly, I had something that couldn't be stolen or manipulated, the hard-won knowledge of my own strength. I was no longer the naive girl who trusted blindly and paid the price. But I wasn't the broken, isolated victim either. I was something new, someone who'd been tested by the worst kind of betrayal and had emerged not just intact, but stronger. The accident had taken away my memories, but it had given me something more valuable, the absolute certainty that I could survive anything. And that knowledge, I knew, would last me a lifetime.